Windhager, Wood, inside 50. Wanganeen Miller! What a mark!
G'day and welcome to the GameDay Squad Aussie Rules Fantasy Show. I'm Haz and alongside me this season is Pitty, and together we are the Fantasy Bros. We've partnered with GameDay Squad to bring you everything you need to know to succeed in this season Aussie Rules competition. Pitty, how you going, mate?
I'm good, thanks, mate. Good to be on the second show. I love that first show and getting a feel for it. So I'm pumped to be talking about a few more teams now.
Yeah, that's it. Can't wait to get into our second team preview today. But before we do that, can you tell our viewers what they can expect from us across this preview series?
Absolutely, mate. This show is the second installment in our preseason team preview series, where over the coming weeks we'll preview all 18 AFL clubs by letting you know their ins and outs, any positional changes from last season, what their primetime fixtures look like, who their under-22 guns are, and finally, who the must-have players are we want to target this season. I believe there's also going to be an exciting pack opening competition where the viewers, as always, can win some pretty special prizes. And don't forget, like and subscribe across all of our socials to keep up to date. Via @FantasyBros AU on YouTube, Instagram, Facebook, Apple Music, and Spotify.
Yeah, you definitely do not want to miss that. If you are new to GameDay Squad, you can sign up using our promo code FBAR26 in all capital letters to get 3 9-player common packs plus a stack of bronze cards to help you get your free-to-play starter squad up and running for the upcoming season. All right, Pitty, let's jump straight into our second 3-team preview for the season. In this episode, we're going to preview the Collingwood Magpies, the Essendon Bombers, and the Fremantle Dockers. Do you want to start by running through how the Magpies went last season, what their prime time and Sunday fixtures look like for our new GDS competitions, and of course, what player movement has occurred over the off-season?
Absolutely, mate. So as you can see there, Collingwood had a pretty good year overall. They finished third, and unfortunately they bowed out in the preliminary final to the eventual premiers. So nothing to be too upset about, really. And they had 16 wins in there with 7 losses. So overall it was a good year. But I guess they still have a few questions coming into 2026 off the back of a good 2025. What does it look like in terms of their lists? How are they planning to move forward? And in terms of that primetime competition, they feature 6 times. So through to round 15, that means they're a good team to target for this competition. And obviously we know that, there's a particular player on their list that if you have a high rarity card for him, you'll be wanting to play that 6 times, I reckon. In terms of the FantasyBros Sunday Showdown, though, they only have 2 in that setup for the first half of the season. So probably not a high priority potentially for that one. Some of the under-22 eligible players that we found on their list. So Ed Allen has a midfielder, Harry DiMattia as a midfielder as well, and Will Hayes as a defender. So probably not 3 names a lot of people would have heard of before. I know there was maybe a bit of chatter about Harry DiMattia maybe a couple of years ago potentially as a promising young player, but we haven't seen him play just yet. So hopefully if he gets a run, he could be someone we look at, but really, I don't think they have a massive amount of those under-22 eligible players will be keen to lock in straight away. Some of the key outs, though, this player movement for Collingwood is probably where it gets a bit interesting. They had Mason Cox, who was delisted. He went over to Freo to continue his career. Will Hoskin-Elliott, he retired. Brodie Myercheck, their key forward, he went off to the Melbourne Demons. And Tommy Mitchell as well, the Pig Mitchell, he was delisted. A bit of a sad day when you see an absolute fantasy jet finish up, isn't it? Gave us lots of good times across the years. And some of their key ins, they actually had no key ins from the draft period. So I just threw there some draft picks and in particular probably Ty Prindable, who went at pick 32. He's the Queenslander. Promising young kids who with a pretty, decent body that's ready to play AFL, you would imagine. It's just a question of whether or not he'll get a go early on. And then Samuel Swadling as well. There's been a bit of chat about him too being quite a good prospect for the Pies. So he went at pick 37. We won't typically talk about draft picks for teams. We often look at just those key player movements from team to team. But as Collingwood didn't really pick anyone up of note, I think they picked up Jack Buller from the Swans, and that was really the main pickup. So we've just thrown a couple draft picks in there. And the other one sitting there right in the corner, those notable position changes, the one we're going to talk about a bit today is Josh Dacos, who has picked up defender status. I'm so glad he did. There were a lot of times last year where, having started GDS, I really wanted to play him because that's the only card I had. Well, not the only card I had. He was a couple of the midfielders that I had to pick from. I really like Josh Dacos, but it was just putting him in that midfield. I knew I was going to get punished because there's some serious ceiling scores there. I like him better as a defender, and he's someone we'll probably chat a bit more about soon.
Yeah, that's exactly right. It is a very sad day when a pig of fantasy sport does get delisted. And Tom Mitchell was certainly that at his prime. Who can forget that season where he did win the Brownlow? I think he had like an average of, 35 touches across the season and just put up some monster scores. So it is a sad day, but it's going to be interesting to see who potentially picks up those midfield minutes that he's left behind. And no doubt, I guess we'll talk about our CBAs in a minute. But it's going to be interesting to see, like I said, who picks up those vacated by Tom Mitchell. And yeah, the key-ins, Jack Buller coming across from the Swans. He's had a couple good games for the Sydney, but he's very raw. He's not going to be fantasy relevant just yet, I don't think. And obviously Mason Cox being delisted, it's going to be interesting to see who plays that backup ruck role now at Collingwood this season.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's jump in now. We'll have a look at some of the key talking points around the fantasy relevant players and positions based on last season's data. So that's thanks to DFS Australia, of course, where you can access that data. And we're looking at particularly the market share of points across the team. So who, again, is contributing to their teams, their fantasy points. We're looking at their centre bounce attendances. So who is around the ball the most when that ball is bounced in the middle at the end of it. When a goal is kicked to the start of quarter. And obviously our kick-in statistics with our play-on percentages. So if we have a bit of a look at that, as you can see, Nick Dacos, in terms of that market share, we know he's at the top. We know he's one of the competition's best players. Darcy Cameron comes in at second as well there with 6.7%, the big ruckman. Josh Dacos is third, and then this is the interesting one. So Tom Mitchell there, who was delisted, he comes in fourth. So he has the fourth most, or contributes the fourth most amount of points to his team's total fantasy points. And Steel Side Bottom rounds that out in fifth. Interestingly, Scott Pendlebury as well. He's sitting there at seventh in terms of that market share. We know he's one of the premier midfielders and has been for a long time, but probably one of the players on that Collingwood side that we would say is starting to move towards the end of his career, given his age. But he just keeps doing what he's doing every season. The centre bounce attendances, you can see Darcy Cameron, he has attended the most with 78%, followed closely by Nick Dacos, Tom Mitchell. So again, in terms of the midfielders they were playing, like he had the second most percentage of CBAs, followed by Scott Pendlebury and Ned Long, who rounds out the fifth, who I really like as a player just personally as well. In terms of that kick-in and play-on percentages, Josh Dacos took the equal most with Jeremy Howe, 66 each, and Dan Houston came in at third with 40, and then some others rounded that out as well. But we'll probably just talk about those three in terms of the kick-ins. Initial thoughts, Haz, as well, around any of those stats in particular. What are you looking at?
Yeah, I come back to my previous point from the last slide. It's Tom Mitchell. It's probably the biggest talking point in and around their list movement, and we can see that the data's backing that up. He's the fourth highest fantasy market share for Collingwood, and he's the third highest, second midfielder in their CBAs. So there is potentially a position up for grabs, whether I don't know who exactly that goes to. I have a feeling, and I'm going to talk about that potentially later on. But it's going to be interesting to see whether they, like you mentioned, Scott Pendlebury, Steel Sidebottom are on the way out. Are they going to potentially look to move them in? Once again, Sidebottom moved to a wing last year. Pendlebury moved to a bit of a half-back role at the end of the year. And I've also heard he's training pre-season down there as well. So it's probably not looking like they're going to go backwards in the age department in the midfield. So maybe it is a Jordan Dugowie if he does get fit. And can play a whole season. If he's in there, he'll be a great pick by himself. Obviously, he can have a monster ceiling day when he's fit and firing. So it's going to be interesting to see who does take that. By the data shows the second midfield spot at Collingwood behind Nick Dacos and probably Ned Long. So don't know who exactly could be in that likely starting centre bounce mix. Like I said, I have a gut feeling, and I'll get to that later. And it might actually impact some of the kick-ins and play-on percentages as well. One player I am intrigued about this season is Dan Houston. He came across last year from Port Adelaide, and he was just highly talked about as a great recruit for them, elite ball skills off back-to-back All-Australian seasons, averaging over 100 points. And he had a really down season, only averaged 70-odd points. So from a Collingwood fan base and from a GDS coaches fan base, or viewership, I should say, we probably expect better from him. And I want to see a big bounce back season from him this year. Obviously, we can see when he does get the opportunity to have those kick-ins, he plays on 100% of the time. So hopefully he can rediscover some of that form that made him an All-Australian halfback flanker for 2 seasons in a row in 2026.
Yeah, absolutely. It was interesting how they decided to use Houston last year as well. Obviously, it was that big recruit that they got from Port Adelaide the year before, and there was a lot of chat about him and his ability to use the ball off halfback and what he might bring to the Pies. But it just seemed to be Josh Dacos that they ended up going to back there as their primary ball mover. And yeah, he just at times probably struggled to find his best form, and in terms of GDS, struggled to be a really consistently good scorer for us. So yeah, do they just say to him, look, we need you to be our primary ball mover back there and see what you can do off the half-back line, and then do something else with Josh Dacos potentially? It's just an interesting one, the way they chose to use him. If you look at the year before, Dan Houston in 2024, he averaged 112.7 GDS points for his coaches. And then going back to 2023, it was 111. So he's really gone from those 2 really good seasons down to a 79, GDS point season. So it was a big drop off. And yeah, is it system? Is it the role that he was given? Is it the fact Josh Dacos was back there taking a lot of the ball? It's just going to be a bit of a watch. Surely that doesn't happen again. Surely they look to him and say, we need you off halfback driving our ball movement.
No, I think that's it. It's probably an adjustment period. Obviously getting traded across, where probably he was the main man at Port Adelaide coming out of the defence, and like you said, Josh Dacos was the one that they try and look to the most. And obviously he's been there for a couple of years. So probably Houston, just an adjustment period. And I think obviously last year was just an outlier in those scoring seasons from the past. And I think he's probably going to look to bounce back now that he's had another year in the system. He's got another preseason under his belt. So I think I expect some bigger things from him this year. And I'll probably see him around that 100 average once again. But we've just covered a whole bunch of fantasy relevant players based on their 2025 statistics. So now let's take a look at some of our Fantasy Bros picks. Where we have each picked one player from the Pies that we are keen on or interested in for the upcoming season. So Pitty, do you want to tell viewers who you are keen on for 2026?
I will. I just actually want to say one more thing that we probably didn't mention before, just before I do talk about Darcy Cameron there, who you can see on screen, just about Tom Mitchell there. If you can flick back to that previous screen just a sec for me. I was just having a look at that then in our data, probably something I didn't talk about a bit more in terms of Tom Mitchell. He comes in at 4th there on the market share, but he only played last year. I was thinking he didn't play many games. The number of games he played last year, four games. And then the year before that, 2024, he played 6. And so if you're looking at the centre bounce attendances there, he's coming out the second midfielder, essentially. That second midfield spot there was 63%, but that's only from, again, it doesn't take into account how many games those players have played. So he's probably one of our little anomalies almost. You can see when he plays that he really does take up one of those positions, because that's probably the main role he plays in the team. But when he's not there, it was probably Dacos, Pendlebury, Long as those 3, with, like you said, that De Goey side bottom at times. McCreary went through there a little bit. So, as you said, it'll be interesting to see what happens. But I just thought I'd point that out as well in terms of that data as a tiny little anomaly. But, I think they do need to look at somebody else for that midfield mix.
Geez, you would have fooled me. I reckon you would have fooled me if you said Tom Mitchell only played 4 games. I could have swore he would have played more. Maybe he was just in and around the news a little bit more than I can remember. But to only play the 4 games, obviously that probably says a little bit why he's so high in that fantasy market share in those CBAs. But obviously, like you said, if he comes in and he's playing that role when he's available to play, he was a depth player at Collingwood last year then. So they're still looking at ways to try and improve their midfield. And I still think they are, like you said, looking to find another solution in there. And I think we'll touch on that a little bit later on.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, sorry to jump in there, mate, and just go backwards a little bit. But
good point.
something to point out anyway. So moving forward now into our picks for the season, I wanted to pick out Darcy Cameron. And look, I want to give him a little bit of love because the big fella, he didn't cop a lot of love as he had his own DNF, did he? Fly McKay came out and said a cheeky little comment about Nick Dacos and his Brownlow, and he ended up coming second there. So Darcy Cameron, I think he deserved that best and fairest because he's just an absolute workhorse, and his data last year encapsulates that perfectly. He averaged 116.6 GDS points for the season, so that has him as the 5th best ruckman we can be picking from this year. And then just to put it in perspective for everyone as well, in last season, so he's averaging 100. He averaged 116. Gawn was our top scoring ruckman. He averaged 127. So he's again, the best part of 10 points off Gawny there by average, and English as well. He was at 124. But again, he's not too far off Rowan Marshall, who was at 3rd. So really, he's in that top 5 rucks. And we played Brodie Grundy a lot towards that back end of the season when he went on a tear. He averaged 119. So my point here is that Darcy Cameron is one of the best rucks in the competition, and we do have to be considering him on weeks, particularly where he has a favourable matchup. And the other thing that I like is when we're picking our ruckman, we only get 2 selections. And because of the rucks, they're around the contest a lot, they have some of them, if they're a decent tap ruckman, they have that elevated floor thanks to being able to get their hit outs. But Darcy Cameron was able to hit huge ceiling scores such as 145, 149, 152, 156, and 157. So Darcy Cameron has a ceiling. He ended up on a really good average. He's a very solid ruckman. But here's where it gets juicy. So I think that he could be a pretty solid pod play on a number of weeks this year. And who knows what else he could be, because we have some new rule changes coming. And that's that last disposal rule. So I want to emphasize it's a last disposal rule. It's not a last touch rule, and it's only between the arcs. So anytime there is a kick or a handball that directly goes out of play, that is going to be a turnover for the other team. So a couple of the other rules, we've got a kicking time reduction. So that time's been reduced for players to kick in. So that's 8 seconds now. They're not just going to wait for players to run in like a Lockie Ash or a Lockie Whitfield or a Dane Zorko, someone to run down and take the kick. They're going to have to take that pretty quickly. And the umpires are allowed to now restart play without actually taking a nominated ruckman. So this, to me, this is probably a discussion we can have another day in terms of what we think we're going to see. I'm not entirely sure we'll see a huge amount of reduced stoppages. We'll have to wait and see what actually happens there. But I do think that the game is going to shift a little bit, and I do think it's going to shift towards a bit of a faster, more free-flowing style. And talking about that, when we look at our ruckman, they can score in a couple of different ways. Ruckmans can score at the source, so they can score at a stoppage, or they can score in general play, which is what we call our sort of transition play. And it's fair to say within our fantasy community, we do expect we have been talking about a potential slight dip in ruck scoring, mainly from those stoppages. So to me, I'm looking at Darcy Cameron for a reason. And you can probably guess where I might be going to with this, but if I asked you which rucks you think have the best transition scoring, so which rucks are going to be potentially least affected if a game transitions towards that really fast style of play, which rucks do you think would be less affected by that?
First one that comes to mind would be Tim English, and then probably followed by someone like a Luke Jackson, probably Max Gawn. I'd probably even throw in maybe a Brodie Grundy somewhere in there as well. Probably my first that comes to mind.
Yeah, that's so 3 of those guys you picked out were our top 5 ruckmen last year. They're all of our sort of top players. Now they're in and around there. So Gawny comes in as probably one of the premier ruckmen, and he actually, in terms of that transition scoring, he's the best ruckman for that. And it's probably due to his marking ability as well around the ground and just how dominant he is there with that. So he comes in at number 1, followed very closely by Tim English. Tim English is another one. I think a lot of people have sort of flagged him this year as being someone who they can turn to in the ruck line to see, how these rules actually end up playing out. He feels like a bit of a safe pick. Funnily enough, Darcy Cameron comes in at 3rd. So he's rated as the 3rd best ruckman for scoring with points in transition. And then Jackson follows him. So it goes Gawn, English, Cameron, and Jackson. And then Grundy's just next at 5th. And then there's just some daylight after that. So it's just interesting. If we think that game is going to move towards a faster play style, then I think Darcy Cameron coming in 3rd for his transition scoring could be a pretty solid play. And he's pretty good around the ground too in terms of his hit out and his tap work. So I think for me, given all this, Cameron looks to be a bit of a solid option in our ruck line yet again, and maybe even a bit of a pod if everyone wants to roll with some of the bigger name rucks like your Gawn, English, Grundy and so forth. So I'm pretty keen on him this year. I'm not sure if I'll play him instantly. I don't know if I'm that confident, but I flagged him as someone to keep an eye on, pending how this game goes. He could be a bit of a shout.
Yeah, I think you've nearly sold him on me, or sold him to me, I should say. It's pretty interesting, that stat there. I wouldn't have thought he would rank 3rd in the transition scoring, and he beat out people like Luke Jackson, Brodie Grundy and Rowan Marshall. But yeah, he averaged well last season, 5th best in the ruck line. Like I said, he might not even have a backup ruck this year at Collingwood, and probably going to be a Jack Buller. So yeah, maybe Darcy Cameron does play a bit more time on ground, a bit more ruck time. And yeah, if he continues that transition scoring, then he's a great shout, and definitely someone that I need to keep an eye on for the rest of the preseason and the early rounds of the season once we get a better idea on how it's going to impact the ruck scoring.
Yeah, sorry, just on that too, mate. You mentioned a good point there. The fact he is the number 1 man with Mason Cox going out, he's off to Fremantle, like you said, who does help chop out. And if we look at some other rucks like a Rowan Marshall as well, I'm sure we'll talk when we get to St Kilda, the fact they've brought in another ruckman to help him, how does that impact his scoring potentially? So I like the fact Darcy Cameron has that number 1 role, and that's not going to change unless something, touch wood, happens to him.
Yeah, 100%. Definitely agree with that one. That brings me into Josh Dacos. So we obviously talked a little bit about him earlier on, and we said we would come back to him. So the big reason I am keen on Josh Dacos this season is due to that positional change that he has in GameDay squad this season. He's moved from a midfielder to a defender, which makes him a legitimate option nearly every week in our backlines. He averaged 112.3 points last season, and he has improved on his season scoring from the previous season for the last 3 years, which suggests he always finds some different ways to continue to improve from a scoring point of view. His average of 112.3 would have seen Josh finish as the 8th best scoring defender from last season, and that was in the midfield line, so where he was eligible to be picked from last season. That was only good enough for 18th, so it makes him straight away that more legitimate option in our lineups each week, showcasing just that how important that defender status is for him. So he played majority of the season off that halfback flank where he was able to use his elite ball skills to drive the Pies forward. Obviously, we already talked about the impact that Dan Houston didn't have on Collingwood, and that was pretty much because they just went through Josh Dacos all the time. But he only saw CBAs twice throughout the season up until round 18, where he had 3% CBAs in round 9 and 11 in round 11. However, we did see a slight change in his role at the back end of the season. After going into halftime goalless against the Gold Coast Suns in round 18, Fly threw the magnets around a little bit, and Josh was thrown into the midfield, and boy, oh boy, he did not disappoint coaches. And I don't think he disappointed some fans as well, because he had a second half to remember, I should say. He had 41% of CBAs in that second half alone and was a clear best on ground to finish with a massive 154 GDS points, which was a season high for him. He had games of 22%, 17%, 14%, and 19% CBAs in the following 4 games, which translated to an average of 119.4 from rounds 18 to 22. He had another 20% CBAs in the prelim final against the Lions for another score of 122 GDS points. And the Pies, as we talked about, have often been criticised for being too old and too slow in that midfield. And boy, Josh certainly helped change that dynamic in the back half of the season. He's electric around the ball, just like his brother. If they team up, geez, if we can see those two in that midfield in 2026, I think Nick obviously is nearly a must every week. And Josh nearly becomes a must in the back line if he's able to get that midfield role in 2026. So he becomes a high upside option for coaches in our defence each week, because there's nothing better than being able to play a midfielder in another position in GDS, and I'm sure we'll talk about that quite a lot over the preseason.
Yeah, I love that. That's a great pick. As soon as we found out he had defender status, I was very excited. I'm glad you got to talk about him there. And I still remember that Gold Coast game, and probably just another reason why you're the most kissed coach in Game Day squad at the moment. You know, I know you played him that particular week, and he was sitting there with, you know, bottom lip hanging down on the chair at Metricon, and to see him then do that in that last quarter was just phenomenal. So, yeah, it's exciting what he can do this year if he gets that midfield role, and just how he changes that. And like you said, I think Nick Dacos, I think he would actually benefit from his brother going in there too. So we'll have to wait and see what happens there. But I really do like him as a pick for our backlines. So that brings us to the end of our Collingwood Magpies preview. We'll now preview the Essendon Bombers. Haz, do you want to run through how they went last season, what their special comps summary looks like, and, of course, their key player movement and positional changes for 2026?
Yeah, of course. So Essendon finished 15th on the ladder last season with only the 6 wins and the 16 losses. They had a pretty positive start to the season, but after that, I think everything just went downhill, and it was pretty much all from injuries. Every week there seemed to be a key injury come out of that team, whether it was during the game or at training. It just seems to be there was news every week. Another key Essendon player had been injured. They played the most players in AFL, VFL history last season. I think it was 39 players across the season, which just shows how decimated they were from that injury front. That poor season leaves the Bombers with just 2 primetime appearances in 2026 up until round 15. And we know they were very primetime heavy this season, last season in 2025, but that is definitely changing in 2026. And then in the bottom handful of teams in terms of the primetime fixtures, so probably not looking to target Essendon Bombers. Obviously, in those 2 games, they will be competing with other teams. But just something to keep in mind. They do have the 5 FantasyBros Sunday Showdown fixtures locked in, which makes them a little bit more appealing for coaches for that competition. The cards may come in handy quite often, especially, you know, because we do have a limited options for that Sunday showdown, depending on how many games are being played there. They do have some pretty good under 22 eligible players. Angus Clark, Nate Caddy, Zach Johnson, Isaac Kako, who's just a live wire up forward. I love watching him play. Archer May and Archie Roberts, who was another outstanding player last year, and he's definitely taken some steps to improve his game over the last couple seasons. Now to talk about their player movement, so some key outs. Sam Draper's obviously headed to the Lions, but he was out injured pretty much all of last season anyway, so it's probably not going to impact too much of the fantasy scoring. Well, actually it will, because Todd Goldstein actually also got delisted. So the 2 primary ruckmen from last season are out. So who picks up that role? And it's probably going to be some of those youngsters that we might talk about later on in Nick Bryan and Vigor Vicentina. Sorry if I mispronounced that. They're the only 2 backup or only ruckmen now left at that club. So be interesting to see what happens there. Ben Hobbs got delisted. Jaden Laverde's been delisted, and Dylan Shield has also been delisted. Key ins, Braden Fiorini come across from the Gold Coast Suns, and then obviously they've got some pretty handy draft picks come across as well, and they haven't really got any notable position changes for Game Day squad this season. Is there anything that really stands out there, Pitty?
No, I think you've hit the nail on the head in terms of just that, probably that ruck role, who takes that between our boys Vizentini and Nick Bryan. I personally probably really like Nick Bryan as a prospect. He played a few games last year and looked really good in the ruck, held his own, pretty solid scoring output as well. What did he have there? Well, actually in GDS, 66.3. Like, I'm not saying go and play him, but he passed the eye test, I thought, for someone coming in for his first few games. He obviously is coming back from an injury, though. He did his knee. He had his ACL, so he is still recovering from that, and it'll just be dependent on whether he's fit, when he's fit, I should say, and he'll have to work into the season, obviously, but I probably like him. It's just, those stocks, that's going to be interesting to see how they go throughout the year in terms of that ruck line. they may potentially be someone we target with our ruckman in terms of a matchup. And then obviously with a few of those players, Ben Hobbs has gone through the midfield a fair bit. Dylan Shields gone through as well at times, being played off halfback others. So again, I think the midfield is going to be an interesting discussion shortly when we get to that.
Yeah, I like it. So let's look into some of their 2025 data and do a bit of a deep dive. So I'll run through their fantasy market share, CBAs, and their kick-in monopoly. So Zach Merritt was the key fantasy market share last year, coming out on top for the Bombers at 6.9%. Obviously, everyone knows what happened over the offseason. He wanted to get out of there so badly. We're still yet to see how that translates to the field and whether there are any lingering concerns or backlash towards him from teammates. Obviously, he's relinquished the captaincy. So that's going to be a bit of an interesting watch over the start of the season and obviously towards the back end of the season as well if he requests another trade. So definitely one to keep an eye on. Jai Caldwell, who I think we're going to talk about a little bit about later on, 6.6%. Unfortunately, Nick Martin's injured this season and he's going to miss the full season, but he had a 6.3%. Will Setterfield, Darcy Parish, and Archie Roberts, some key players for the Bombers, round out their top 6, probably most fantasy relevant players. CBAs, so Todd Goldstein, obviously he has retired. He was the highest. Will Setterfield, interestingly, comes in as the highest rated midfield in the CBAs. Vigor Visitini, as I mentioned there, only played a couple games. Jai Caldwell, Merritt, and Parish, probably. And then obviously, as you mentioned earlier, that young ruckman, Nick Bryan, as well, before his injury, did have a fair share of centre bounce attendances as the starting ruckman. So there are 4 ruckmen on that list. So obviously 2 of them are gone. So it probably means that the 2 on there, Vigor and Brian, will probably share the ruck duties I'm suggesting this year. But other than that, we'll move into the kick-on and play-on percentages. Mason Redmond had the fair share of kick-outs last year with 100 kick-ins, and he played on it 87% of the time. Ridley, in the games that he was available, 31 kick-ins. Jackson Pryor, Archie Roberts, and Andy McGrath round out the top 5. Interesting enough, actually, Zach Merritt had 14 kick-ins, and probably the reason he's probably low on that CBA's list is the fact that he did get moved behind the ball at the back half of the season. Obviously, he did get moved to half-back. They tried to use his elite ball skills, and then obviously that impacted his CBAs. Don't know how it actually impacted his scoring. I think he did have a couple of down weeks, but I think he'll be back in the midfield this season, and I don't expect that experiment to continue. Is there anything that really stands out to you, mate, when looking at that data?
There's a few things. I do think Essendon are quite an interesting team to be watching this preseason and early on in the season from our fantasy perspective. So if we look at Zach Merritt, for example, who contributes the most amount of points to his team's total fantasy points, I think surely he just continues doing what he does. Like, surely all this chatter about him wanting out over the off season and yes, relinquish the captaincy, surely that doesn't affect him, you reckon?
I wouldn't think so. He is a genuine top-line gun. He has won 7 best and fairest at that club, which just shows how elite he can be, not only from a fantasy point of view, his impact on the field. He leads from the front every single week. Look, I personally don't blame him for trying to get out of Essendon and looking for a fresh start. I think he probably needs it, but obviously it didn't happen, so he's there. I still think he's going to put his best foot forward every single week. He's going to try and lead from the front regardless if he has that captaincy or not. He's tied to that club. He was a captain of that club. He's going to go down as a Hall of Fame player for that club. So I don't see his output dipping too much this season or changing. Do you agree with that or do you disagree?
Yeah, no, I agree with that for sure. I think he's the ultimate professional as well. I think he's very happy to have just left that. And I think the media may have, continued on with that for a bit longer than they should have. I think he's, absolute professional, and I don't expect him to be doing, anything less than what he has been doing. Maybe the only thing is if he is shuffled around a little bit outside of that midfield, but I wouldn't imagine so. I still think he'll probably be the one they go to. So my other interesting thing I think we have a bit of a chat about is it's hard to predict, but what that midfield looks like. Who's going to be in there? So we Will Setterfield, for example, they love having him in the midfield when he's playing. Merritt's in there a lot, obviously, as well. Caldwell when he's playing too. Parrish when he's fit, they want him in there. Sam Durham looks really good in there too, and he's one I probably do rate more from like that footballing side of things and maybe less from a fantasy side perspective at the moment. He only averages 92 points for us from a GDS perspective, but I think what he brings to that midfield, being that bigger body and his marking ability overhead, is incredible. He gives 110%. He's a bloke you just want to play with every single week. So I hope they have him in there, and if he's at 57% CBAs, I would like that a bit higher personally. So it's going to be interesting to see who they run with. Jai Caldwell, I think hopefully he is fit as well, because I think he could have a cracking year. Again, he's someone that you're going to be talking more about soon, but he needs to be pulling through there. It's going to be an interesting watch, I think. And don't forget they had Braden Fiorini come in from the Suns, who's a proven fantasy player in the past. He scored, he averaged 101 GDS points last season, but I probably see him more playing on the outside than around the ball, at stoppage. Getting centre bounces. So he's one I think might be on a wing potentially. I'm just going to be fascinated to see who they end up rolling with, and I feel it might change and shuffle around a little bit. It's going to be hard to predict, and it could also depend on the fitness of players.
That's the one thing I probably take away from it, is we're relying on Essendon players actually being fit. And obviously last season that was a very rare occasion that everyone was fit and available for selection. So it makes it really hard to read into who might be there based on the data, because the data was spread across, like, obviously number 10, Elijah Sardis there, 46% for the season of CBAs, where other clubs are probably down to 10% with their 10th best player. So they have spread the load. Obviously, I know there are 4 ruckmen in there, but I think if they're looking at everyone's fit come round 1, to me, the 3 players that probably get the start are Zach Merritt, Darcy Parish, and Jai Caldwell. I think those 3 are the best pure midfielders that the club has. I agree with you about Sam Durham. I think he's probably the 4th midfielder that comes in and gives the others a spell. It's a bit of an impact player, might you say. I don't see Will Setterfield playing too much of a role this year. I believe he actually got delisted at the end of last season, and they picked him up again in the rookie draft. So I don't know if that actually, I'm not going to read too much into it, whether that means he's going to have a place in the side or not, or whether he is just a backup if injuries hit once again. But I think, once again, if everyone's fit, it's Merritt, Caldwell, and Parish. And then from there, it could be anyone between Durham, Sardis, if he's able to break in, or potentially one of the rookies. They might just throw him in the deep end and throw him in there. They've got a couple of really good rookies out of this year's draft class. So, yeah, it'll be interesting to see. And I can't wait to see round 1 and who has that spot, because I think they will be fantasy relevant regardless.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a good point you raised there too about the draft class. We haven't been, or we won't be either, talking about those guys a lot in these videos. We're sort of focusing on the lists from the previous year, and we'll see where these guys sort of slot in. So yeah, I mean, there's every chance that they come in and play as well, and particularly if there's some more injury concerns. There's one player I'm sort of surprised not to see in that centre bounce attendance data or the market share is Andrew McGrath. He's not in either of those.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah, I mean, he's one that you sort of look at. He's taken up that captaincy there for Essendon this year, and he's one of the stalwarts of the club. I think, clearly picking up the captaincy internally, he's rated incredibly highly. But just from that fantasy perspective, I don't see him going through the middle again. I feel like he went in through the middle last year because of all the injuries that they had, and it was out of necessity more so than what they want. I think they sort of see him playing down that back line, particularly with the leadership he can provide now, given that he's got that captaincy. And even prior to the captaincy, he clearly had those leadership capabilities. But I think they see him playing down in that back line there. I'm not even sure it's in that distributing role. But, I don't probably have him super highly on my defender rankings at the moment. I'd probably have to do a bit more of a deep dive into all of our defenders and start looking at where they might rank with one another. But at the moment, he's not one that's sort of screaming out to me.
No, and I think you raised a really good point for the fact that obviously at the back end of the season, he did go through that midfield, and the fact that he's not even in the CBAs or the fantasy market share probably means that he didn't, I guess, do that well when he got thrown into the midfield. And obviously I'm just talking off pure feel here. I don't have the data in front of me, but that suggests that his CBAs weren't that high when he did play. Obviously we just went through Tom Mitchell, and he played 4 games and finished third as the CBA percentages. So even though McGrath had the opportunities in there, I think he is better used elsewhere in that team. And I think he is a really good rebounding halfback alongside Archie Roberts and Mason Redmond. So that's probably where I think they'll lean to once again this season, because I think, once again, this is if everyone is fit. I think they have high hopes for Jai Caldwell and Darcy Parish. And obviously Zach Merritt is in there as the ultimate professional, as we said. He's probably their best midfielder. So I don't know where McGrath fits in, and I don't see him fitting in the midfield mix if everyone is fit. But while we're on the topic of everyone being fit, and I will talk a little bit about Darcy Parish, because he did only play the 3 games last season where he averaged 96.3 points. But we do know Parish can be a genuine top selection in the midfield. However, a little bit similar to Sam Walsh in our last preview episode when we looked at Carlton, the problem with Darcy Parish is always his body. In 2022, he averaged 115.81 points from his 16 games, and then increased his average to 123.78 from his 18 games in 2023, which saw him finish as the 10th highest ranked midfielder in the competition. However, in 2024, his average decreased 20 points to 104.92 in 12 games. So from that, straight away, the biggest thing for me to take away from is that Parish has failed to play more than 18 games in a season since 2022. And he's averaged only 12 games a year over that 4-year stretch, which is a bit of a concern. Obviously, last year, having the 3 games obviously brings that number down a little bit. But he's not averaging, he's only just averaging over half a season every single year for the last 4 years. So when fit, he's given the keys to the midfield, and I think I'm going to stand by that. When he's fit, Essendon love throwing him around the ball because he does impact the play, and he can be a very, very good midfielder. Even though he only played 3 games last season, he did finish as the 4th highest ranked CBA midfielder at the Bombers with 58%, as we've already touched on. But in saying that, and you brought this up earlier before we started recording, his time on ground has been relatively low, hovering at 71, 62, and 79% in those 3 games that he played last season. So you would imagine that they probably do manage him on return, obviously, once again, depending how he goes through the preseason. But he's only, and since 2021, coming back to the idea of them throwing him the keys, he's averaged 71.8% of the CBAs for Essendon. So I think if fit, Darcy Parish he's a great pod, and he might be one that you look to target in the Sunday FantasyBros Showdown. Outside of that, I don't think he's going to mix it with the best until we see him fit and firing.
Yeah, that's the big one. And I think with Parish as well, probably the thing I can see happening is they do manage his time on ground, like you alluded to that they did last year. And again, that is out of necessity. Like, they do have to be really careful with him and really build him into the season. I haven't heard many hiccups so far this preseason, but with Parish, that can happen at any time. He's bloody been the bane of my existence the last few years. I've had him in a keeper league that I play in, and just been struggling to get him on the park. And the only thing I will say is that, if he can sort of get his body right, and if he's feeling confident, even with low time on ground, he can still score well. He's really good in terms of being a points per minute player. And probably the only time I might consider playing him as a pod, regardless of his fitness, regardless of whatever's going on, is if there's a medal up for grabs. Because I feel like whenever there's a big game on, Anzac Day, he's a very good chance of scoring, 140, 150 GDS points, because he just loves the medal hanging around his neck. So I think that's probably the other thing, is that he can score quite quickly. But yeah, as you said, it's his body for me that I'm not confident in, and I will not be playing him until I sort of see otherwise.
Yeah, I absolutely love that shout. I think we need to move on to the two players that we are looking to target this season. I'm going to go first, and I'm going to look at Jai Caldwell. Obviously, coming off the back of Darcy Parish, I think that's a pretty much a good segue. Caldwell is coming off a career best GDS season last year, despite only playing the 11 games after 2 separate injuries. He injured his hamstring during training after their round 3 game, which meant he missed the next 6 games. And then, unfortunately, he suffered a season-ending syndesmosis injury in that last quarter against the Suns in round 17. I do often forget that Caldwell is still actually relatively young. He is only 25. He seems to be progressing each year in the AFL system, and I feel like every year he gets a little bit better, and he gets a little bit better every single year. He increased his season average by 20 points from 2023 to 2024, when he went from an average of 86.1 in 21 games to 108.39 from 23 games in 2024. He averaged 118.5 in those 11 games last season, which saw him rank as the 8th best midfielder for the season, showcasing his ability to improve and 5 those ways to increase his scoring. He had 65% of the Bombers' CBAs when fit last season, the second most for an Essendon midfielder behind Will Setterfield's 75%, as we just discussed. He did have a season high score of 170 points in round 1. He started the season with an absolute bang. He went thanks to 36 touches, 4 marks, and 11 tackles, highlighting how big his ceiling is when everything aligns for him. He had 8 games over 100 points and 6 games over 120 points from his 11 games played, highlighting how consistent and reliable he can be when fit and firing. He had a season low score of 69 when his CBAs hit a season low of 50. So he could potentially be a little bit role dependent for his scoring based on those CBAs. But I expect Caldwell to be one of the main midfielders for the Bombers this season. And if he can have around 65% of CBAs each game, then he becomes a very interesting pod play in all competitions. I'll be looking into target in their 2 primetime fixtures and probably their 5 Sunday Showdown fixtures this season.
Yeah, that's a great pick. I'm big on Jai Caldwell this season as well, and I think you're right. I think he needs to be, one of, if not the main midfielder for them this season. And his ceiling, hey, he's just an absolute stat stuffer. He sort of fits into that category with your Josh Dunkley and your Jordan Dawson, where he just fills his stat lines with marks, tackles, kicks. Just a genuine all-round fantasy player. So I'll jump into my player now, Archie Roberts. He's my pick for the Bombers this year, someone I'm interested in. He's one of our under-22 young guns that we can target in this new competition that is adding more value to the cards that we have at our club. And I think he's potentially shaping up as a sneaky option in our standard competition backlines. But there are a few things I want to see first. So first and foremost, Roberts, he had a fantastic season last year. So he averaged 100 GDS points down back for the Dons, and that was from 22 games. And interestingly, if you go back to his year before, his first season, his debut season, he actually averaged 98.8 GDS points. So he's been pretty consistent in terms of his scoring output across those first 2 seasons. The only thing is from that first year, he only played 4 games. So his first 4 games, he was averaging 98 GDS points, which is just incredible. And the fact he backed that up in his second season from 22 games, so a larger sample size, probably speaks to the quality of player that he is. And the Bombers seem to like the ball in his hands too, and exiting their D50. And I really like the consistency that he's shown as a young player. Now, whether the balls ended up in his hands out of necessity or because they really do want him bringing that out, I'm not too sure. But I really like the way that he does use the ball coming out of that back line. He always seems to make really good decisions, and he's a good kick as well. So coming into his 3rd year, we could truly see a bit of a breakout from him if he's able to access a market share of those GDS points that are available down back. But again, I think for him to access that market share of points down there, I'll be watching sort of how he works with some of those other defenders. We know that Jordan Ridley, super talented defender. We know he missed large chunks of last season, and he's a really, really proven fantasy player. Mason Redman, he's also a proven fantasy player too. He's got a massive ceiling on his day. He missed a patch for the middle portion of last year. Nick Martin obviously did his knee in round 18, or more accurately, Ryan Mansell did it for him. We also saw Andrew McGrath go into the middle at the end of last year once they lost Caldwell and Setterfield to injury. So there were just a lot of moving parts that once they come back this year, I do just wonder how it affects his role back there, and ultimately how that then affects his scoring scoring output. But putting that aside, given the data of the last couple of years and again, what he's looked like playing down back, I think he's still good enough to improve on that average. And I'm keen to be hopefully playing him in our under-22 squad. And as I said, maybe keeping an eye on him as a bit of a smoky pod for our last defender position some weeks.
Yeah, love that shout. I think you're right. Obviously, there were quite a few moving parts. Obviously, we talked about how injury ravaged the Dons were last season. But even regardless, I think everyone's fit. Archie Roberts is still probably one of the best ball users at that club. And if we're looking at the under-22 competition, he is a lock for me because he averaged the most in defenders eligible for the under-22 competition, followed by Jasper Fletcher and Colby McKercher. So he's topping some pretty fantasy relevant players there that have had success. And I'll be definitely looking to target him in the fantasy or in my under-22 competition backline this season without a doubt, regardless if there is potentially a bit of an impact on his scoring, because he's still going to average probably either the third or the fourth best under-22 defender this season. But that brings us to the end of our Essendon Bombers preview. We will now preview the Fremantle Dockers. Pitty, do you want to run us through how they went last season and the special comp summary and the key player movement from the off-season?
Yeah, absolutely. So looking at the Fremantle Dockers, they finished 8th at the end of last season. So they had 16 wins and 7 losses, and they lost a cracking elimination final to the Gold Coast Suns. Unfortunately for them, they, again, across their season, probably had a lot of really close games, and their form might have been patchy at times, but they just had an ability to come from behind. And it was probably off the back of, a slight change in their play style and the way they want to move the ball. I don't know if you can remember back to 2024, potentially, maybe it was last year, I'd have to remember, but I remember we really liked the way that Jordan Clark and Luke Ryan would move the ball back there, because they would just wax between each other, but not necessarily take it forward. And that would just mean bulk points for us. And then JL came out and basically said, no, there'll be none of that happening here. Yep. And then since then, they've sort of had a bit of an exciting brand of footy and an ability to get the ball on the outside. And it ended up getting them into a finals berth. And again, that elimination final, it was a kick either way. Like, it was really just a bit of a toss of the coin at the end as to who was going to finish in front, because it was just back and forth and such an exciting game. So, yeah, a good season overall. I'm sure the fans would have been hoping for more. I'm sure they're hoping for more this year, but promising nonetheless, and a cracking game to end that season. In terms of the special competitions, they feature 6 times, which again, that's equal with Collingwood. So that makes them a nice little team to have a look at your stockpile of cards if you're planning on playing this competition. And I also like Collingwood. Sorry, the Dockers. Just, I hope I didn't say that. I also like Collingwood, because I do not. I wanted to say also like Collingwood. The Dockers only feature 2 times in the Sunday time slot. So again, they're probably not one to go out and target in that particular competition. But the under-22 eligible players, there's one there that I'm really excited by in particular. That's Murphy Reid. He burst onto the scene last year. He's eligible as a forward for us. Looked like, again, a bit of a live wire and could just somehow find the goals. Josh Draper as a defender, and Cooper Simpson, who's also available as a defender. I believe he played a couple of games last year potentially, but he's also available back there. Some of their key outs, they had James Aish retire, Nat Fyfe retired as well, and Michael Walters also retired. So they have some experience that is leaving their club this year, and some absolute stalwarts, that's for sure, in terms of Sonny Walters and Nat Fyfe, what they've done for the club. Nat Fyfe was one of my favourite players when I was, going through high school. I thought just in his prime, he was one of the best players to have ever played the game. And just probably started to change that trend in our midfielders, becoming that really tall hybrid style that we're now seeing. Some of the key ins they had, so Judd McVie from the Melbourne Demons, you'd imagine he sort of plays in the back line, and Mason Cox as well from Collingwood. He'll be coming over, which could make a few things interesting in terms of what he does. Some of the notable position changes, the main one to talk about is Luke Jackson, who has now changed from a forward to a ruck, which, that's probably the one that we'll talk a little bit about. I'm happy to talk about it now if you are, mate, but that's one that has, caught my attention as soon as I saw that.
Yeah, if you want to go ahead and you can talk about that, and then I'll talk about some things that I've taken away from that as well. You can go first.
Yeah, for sure. So Luke Jackson there, again, last year, I played him a number of times in GDS as a forward because of his ability to go through the midfield and also play in the ruck. And their other ruckman being Sean Darcy, he would often be injured for parts of the season, where it meant that he would then go into ruck and pretty much play that primary ruck role. And I remember Sean Darcy was injured last year. They were coming up against the Bombers at home, and it was just the matchup to target, and he had an absolute monster score, kicked some goals, was in the ruck, pretty much around the whole ground. So he's a star of a player, and it's just a shame that he did lose that forward status, because he moves to a ruck line now that, as I said before, they hit these massive ceiling scores of 140s and 150s, and they do it quite regularly too. So you got Max Gawn in there, you've got Tim English, Brodie Grundy. We talked about Darcy Cameron earlier. Rowan Marshall typically as well, but again, he's probably a conversation we'll have when we get to St Kilda, what his scoring might look like this year. There's just a lot of big names, big ceilings, big consistency, and Luke Jackson can be one where if he's not playing in that ruck role, some games I question what his ceiling will be. But if he's playing in that number one ruck role, he still could be what I'll call probably a pod some weeks, playing in that ruck line, particularly if he's got a favourable matchup, because he can hit the scoreboard, he can push forward, and like I alluded to before, his ability to score points when that ball is in motion is as good as any other ruckman in the competition. So, yeah, my only concern with him, I guess, is the line that we're able to select him on.
Yeah, I agree. I think the biggest thing for Luke Jackson and anyone that's keen on playing him in the ruck position is the fact that he probably will be sharing the ruck duties. If we're looking at him as a ruckman, he will be sharing those duties with Sean Darcy. And we know that the Freo Dockers prefer Darcy as probably the number one tap ruckman at the club. But once again, the new rules, don't know how that potentially changes the way they attack this season with those rules. If Jackson's more mobile to get around the ground and get to these stoppages that umpires are no longer going to wait for, maybe Darcy isn't the starting ruck anymore, and maybe he finds himself on the outer, especially if they've got Mason Cox now, who could potentially push forward and stretch teams out defensively and then pinch hit the ruck, and they have Luke Jackson as that primary ruck. And it's going to be interesting to see, because if he gets primary ruck, I think he's a must nearly in the ruck line, even though we've got some big names like Max Gawn and Tim English, and obviously you just talked about Darcy Cameron before. If Luke Jackson does get the solo ruck without having Sean Darcy in the side, I think he becomes a very, very good pick, because we know him as a unicorn. He can play around on the ball, like you mentioned. He can impact up forward and kick goals. I think he'll be a very good pick, and only time will tell to see how these rule changes actually impact at the Freo Dockers, because I have heard that Mason Cox is having a very, very good preseason, and he's knocking the door down to try and get into that side. So they do have some good depth in the ruck department. It's just whether or not Jackson plays as a ruck, or he plays in and around the ruck as a midfielder or a tall body up forward. It's going to be wait and see, but it's one that I'm definitely keeping an eye on without a doubt this preseason. You got anything else to add to that, mate?
Happy to move on to our next deep data dive as well, if we want to have a look through that.
Just one thing that I did quickly want to touch on before we do move on. It's not on the list there, but a notable position change. Wasn't high on the averages last season, but he is on that under 22 eligible players there, and that is Murphy Reid. I'm going to talk about him in a little bit, but he has moved from midfield status to forward status for this season. So that's one to keep an eye out for next season.
Yeah, that's a good shout there too.
All right, mate, do you want to take us through the deep dive for the Freo Dockers from 2025?
Absolutely. So looking at that market share there, you can see their number one scoring player there, Andrew Brayshaw as well. So he contributes 7.1% of his team's scoring. Luke Jackson comes in at second, exactly the player who we just spoke as well about. So he's that second player that's contributing the most to their team. And Caleb Sarong coming in at third, followed by our two defenders we spoke about or mentioned just before in Jordan Clark and Luke Ryan. They round out that top five. And there's also some familiar names that sort of contribute in that bottom 10. Shea Bolton, one of the forwards we can pick from in GDS. And obviously Hayden Young as well, who we haven't spoken too much about just yet, but we might talk about him soon. Because if we look across at those CBAs, you'll see him sitting there in that sort of top five players attending the centre bounces. Caleb Sarong and Andrew Brayshaw are their top two mids quite clearly, followed by Jackson and Darcy. And I think Jackson's numbers are probably, obviously from when he's playing ruck, but also when he does play on ball, he's the only ruckman that probably plays on ball, I think, from memory. So, yeah, that's where those numbers are coming from. But Hayden Young, 40%, I think he's a player, again, who's probably struggled with a bit of fitness, and they would love to have him around the ball a bit more often. But I've just had to manage him at times when he has been playing. And then Jay Bolton as well, again, that forward. So he comes in, and similar to a Cosy Pickett or an Isaac Rankin, for example, that typical live wire forward coming in and playing through the middle, just to add a bit of that X factor and change up that midfield dynamic as well. He's sixth there on their list in terms of attending centre bounces, and always nice for a forward when they can be rolling through the middle and having access to some more points. In terms of the kick-ins, Luke Ryan took the most. He's an absolute pig for those kick-ins. He will rip it off his teammates and take it out of their hands. He'll push them out of the way. He'll yell at them. He'll do everything he can to make sure that he's getting those kick-ins. And Jordan Clark will scrap for whatever he can get as well, taking 67. And then there's not much left over for everyone else. So only 6 players took some kick-ins last year, which was interesting when you look at some other teams and their kick-in data. It's really dominated here by Luke Ryan and Jordan Clark. And particularly from that defender side of things, I do like Jordan Clark there as a defender selection for the Dockers, again, because he's taking a fair chunk of his team's kick-ins, and he's a bit more attacking than Luke Ryan as such, and they like to use him off that half-back line. So I don't mind him as a little pick there in our back lines, week to week. What's standing out initially, mate, to you in terms of the market share or CBAs?
Yeah, I really like the Hayden Young shout. Obviously, we know how talented he is, and I think they probably rate him as the third best midfielder at the club behind Sarong and Brayshaw. So when fit and firing, hopefully we see that come round one for the Dockers. Hayden Young will definitely be straight into that starting midfield mix because we know he can impact games. He's got a lethal left foot. He went forward in stages last season and really impacted with some goals, and he's got a big frame, so he can be a bit of a dangerous threat down there as well and really stretch out oppositions because, they've got big forwards like Tracy, Voss, and last one's not coming. Amos, thank you. So, yeah, they can stretch him out, and if you potentially throw Mason Cox into that mix as well, he could be a handful down forward, Hayden Young, and really put up some big scores if he can impact that scoreboard and kick some goals. Shea Bolton, I don't think we have to talk too much about him. He is a very impact-heavy player. He doesn't really stat pad as much as other players do, I guess we could say. He is very reliant on some very short bursts through the midfield to get those touches up for the game, and often goal reliant as well. So he's not someone that I'm probably looking to play in many comps, maybe if for their Sunday fixtures or their prime time, maybe. But outside of that, I don't think I'm looking to play him in our normal competitions. But yeah, other than that, the one interesting one that once again, I'm going to keep coming back to this guy a little bit before I get to him. Murphy Reid not actually featuring in a centre bounce attendances surprises me from last season. He did get a bit of a taste in there. They did draft him as a midfielder, so it's interesting to see that in his first season he didn't really get given a genuine crack. And I think, and I hope, and I'm going to talk about it once again later on, that he gets some more chances in there this season.
Yeah, that's a good pick. I think coming in as well, has to probably bide his time a little bit. You've got some big names in there in that midfield in terms of Sarong, Brayshaw, Jackson, Darcy, Young when he's fit, Bolton coming through at times. They had Jager O'Meara as well, who was sort of playing there. You've got some other boys that are really chomping at the bit to get some midfield time too. So he probably does need to bide his time. And I think from, that football perspective, probably needs to develop his engine a little bit too. Obviously learning the ropes and figuring out the system and all that sort of stuff. So hopefully he does. That would be a really good shout if he could get some time around the ball playing forward too in our under-22s comp. That would be absolutely elite. And yeah, like you said, Hayden Young, he's someone that they want to have in that midfield. But some of his scoring last year, again, it just sort of speaks to where his fitness was at. He had a patch of some really good scoring there from rounds 5, 6, 7. He would sort of go 107, 107, 89. It's okay for a midfield spot. But again, round 21, 22, and he just has impact and he can score really quickly. and can push forward and hit the scoreboard too. So he's one I want to watch for that fitness, just like you said.
Yeah, love that. All right, do you want to get into your player that you are keen on for 2026 from the Freo Dockers?
Yeah, absolutely. So just having a look there, my pick is, well, it's an interesting pick, Caleb Sarong, just because I want to flag him for a couple of reasons. So he had a bit of a down year last year with his scoring. His average was down a little bit. He scored 108.5 GDS points. So that was down from 120 the previous year and 125 the year before that. So we were definitely expecting more from him, but it probably was a little bit of reflection around Freo's game style too. Like, he is a big player around the stoppages, and he really relies on a lot of his scoring to come from stoppages. He can really get those clearance kicks, and he's that player that sort of links their inside game to their outside game. So again, like, we probably did expect more, and I'm hoping that he can get back to some of that form from the previous year or two. It's just, there's a few questions for me, and the one that I wanted to raise here and why I wanted to talk about him was, how are these new rules potentially going to affect him? A lot of that narrative this preseason has been around how these rules will impact the rucks, but I also wonder, how much will these rules impact some of these midfielders that do play around the stoppage and rely on their points coming from stoppage scoring? And interestingly, when we look at sort of a midfielder and look at how many points they score when that ball's in open play and when the ball is at a stoppage, this is where it does get really interesting, because Caleb Strong scores a large chunk of his points there. And in fact, he is if we consider him clearly one of the top ranked midfielders in the game, but he is the worst scoring midfielder for transition points, just behind Matty Rao. All right, the two absolute bulls at that stoppage. If we also want to throw Cripper into that conversation, then that sort of bumps Sarong up to having the second fewest transition points. So in a year for me where there's a bit of uncertainty around how these rules are going to affect players, particularly the rucks and the mids, I'm probably going to look to avoid him early, pending the matchup and fixture, until I can sort of see how these rules affect him and others. And obviously if they're going to have Hayden Young going through there too. So I think that he's a quality player. I think he can bounce back from his down year last season, especially because he's shown that monster ceiling, which we love in GDS. He's hit some absolutely monster scores in his, even last season, in the 170s. He scored 170 in that first game, for example, and even against the Suns in that final, he scored 162. So he's just got an enormous ceiling on his day. And then the other side of it too is that he can get tagged out of a game really easily and put up a really stinky floor score. So for me, he's just one that I want to watch a little bit. I'm a little bit cautious of. I always seem to play him when he doesn't hit that ceiling score, which I really want, because 170, that will put you a long way to doing well that week. So for me, I just want to watch a few things around Sarong this season. Can he get back to that form, and how do these rules impact him?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up the fact that he can get tagged out of a game. And obviously, when teams look at Freo Dockers, they look at how can they reduce the impact or shut down them at the source. And obviously, Sarong is the big driver there. He's the one that gets in and under. He's the one that feeds the ball out. He's the one that normally makes the first tackle if the ball goes to the opposition. So he's the one that they look to shut down straight away. So any teams that do look to tag when they come up against the Dockers are going to throw someone to Sarong, and he hasn't really found a way to beat the tag yet. So it's going to be interesting to see, once again, like you said, how these rule changes impact his scoring and how that's going to go for him this season. But I think you're right. I think he still bounces back and increases that average of 108 points from last season, probably back into that mid 110, 115 point area.
Yeah, that's a good call. Now, you want to talk us through your Murphy Reed selection?
Yeah, so I've talked about him a couple of times already when we're talking about the Dockers, and obviously he is the rising star from last season. And he, like I'd mentioned earlier, because it wasn't on the slide, but he did have a favourable position change in GameDay squad this season, changing from a midfielder to a forward. He averaged 65.9 points in his first season in the AFL, playing a majority of the season on that half-forward flank, while he had that very brief spell in the midfield in a handful of games. He had games in round 5 and 11 with 4% CBAs and 13% CBAs in round 8. And those games didn't actually directly link to a huge scoring output for Reed, except for round 11. So obviously he only had the 4% CBAs, but he was able to produce a score of 111 points, which was his highest score for the season. But in that game, though, Reid was kind of more reliant on his goals. He kicked 4 goals, had 18 disposals, 3 marks, and 4 tackles, highlighting how he can accumulate GDS points in all facets of the game. His average of 65.9 had him rank as the 12th best under 22 eligible forward last season. However, with another preseason under his belt, I expect bigger and better things from last season's rising star. Freo really love having the ball in his hands because he can create so many opportunities for them moving forward. We talked about Bolton and his X factor. Well, Murphy Reid sets up a lot of the play, and he is the goal assist machine for Freo. I think they may continue to experiment with Reid playing through the midfield at times this season. Obviously, I mentioned that he was drafted as a midfielder and had high hopes. Obviously, got drafted at pick 16. So he can play in the midfield. And like you said, I think he is just biding his time a little bit. But I think more opportunities in the midfield, we could see him have more opportunities to therefore increase his scoring. I expect potentially a 10 to 20 point increase on his average from last season. And that's probably just a bit of a first to second year jump that we're probably going to see. Obviously, last year he kind of was stuck in that forward line. And yes, he did have impact on games, but it was more about the flashy brilliance that we came to see rather than the really big disposal games or really high tackle counts that really made the scoring pop. He only had 200 scores for the season, but I expect, like I said, an increase on his average. And for that reason, he'll need to be considered each week for the under-22 competition, regardless of that 12th best eligible forward for that comp from last season. I think he'll easily be up there in the top 6 this year.
Yeah, that's a great call. He's an absolute star for that team in terms of being a young player for them. Now, mate, that brings us to the end of our Fremantle Dockers preview and the end of our second preview show. However, before we do, it's time for our favourite part of the show, our pack opening game. So, mate, do you want to explain to the viewers quickly how that pack opening game works for our preseason shows?
Yeah, so at the end of every preview show, we will open a 9-player rare all-star pack. And if any players from the 3 teams we previewed in that episode are pulled, they will go straight into the giveaway pool. Today, if any Magpies, Bombers, or Dockers players are pulled, they will go straight into that giveaway pool. To enter the giveaway and have a chance at winning all these player cards, simply subscribe to the Fantasy Bros YouTube page, like the video, and comment who your MVP is for that particular preview show. That means you can have up to 6 entries in the giveaway by the end of our preseason team preview shows. All winners will be drawn in our first live round preview show on the 4th of March before opening round commences. So I'm just going to bring up the packs.
What are the chances we can get a Nick Dacos in here?
Mate, that would be absolutely elite.
He's one that has just absolutely avoided me whenever I've been opening packs. I cannot pack a Nick Dacos.
I can't pack either. I only have bronze Josh Dacoses, so I really need to try and find some in the preseason because, like I said, I'm very keen on him this year. All right, we have our pack available on screen. Can you see that?
I can, mate. Yep.
All right, let's rip it. Let's hope for some Collingwood, Essendon, and Freo players.
Yep, here some big names.
All right, what row would you like, mate?
I'll go middle. Take the middle again, I think.
All right.
Did me well last time.
So we've got a Mick Andrew from Adelaide.
Yep.
Jager Smith.
Hey, there we go. Someone we spoke about.
That's a good card. And steel side bottom. So that goes straight into the giveaway pool. Steel side bottom gold into the giveaway pool. All right, I will open the top row. Sin from Port Adelaide. The Hornbag.
Horn Francis.
And Daniel Rioli from the Gold Coast Suns. So some pretty handy cards there. And then our final row.
Lots of golds in this pack, isn't there?
I think it's an all gold pack. So we've got Ryan from Adelaide. Jackson Mead from Port, and Cam McKenzie from Hawthorn. So steel side bottom will be going into that giveaway pool.
Handy little card there too to go alongside Benny Campriali, one of our young players from the Blues.
So a reminder for all new users who are still looking to sign up when registering using the promo code, it is FBAR26 now. So you can get 3 9-player common packs. And as a bit of a spoiler as well, we will be dropping the first ever Aussie Rules fantasy textbook in the next couple of weeks. The textbook will be your preseason guide to absolutely everything Game Day Squad Aussie Rules. So make sure you keep an eye on all socials for that release date. Our team preview shows will drop every Monday and Thursday on the Fantasy Bros YouTube, Apple Music, and Spotify pages. Don't forget to like and subscribe across all those socials to keep up to date via @FantasyBros AU on YouTube, Instagram, Facebook, Apple Music, and Spotify. Once again, thanks, Pitty. Two team previews down now, 4 to go. Have a great night, mate, and I will see you for the next team preview.
You too, mate. Thanks for the episode, and thank you everyone for watching.
See you later. See you, guys.
Thanks for tuning in to another episode by the Fantasy Bros. If you want to show your support, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this show on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcast. Also, make sure you check us out on TikTok, Instagram, and Facebook. Just search @FantasyBros AU.